Some stories begin with a smile. Some begin with a tear. But this one began with a single sentence whispered in the dark that changed two lives forever. What you are about to read is not something made up. It is not something borrowed from a movie or pulled from a novel sitting on a dusty shelf. This is a story that lived and breathed in real bones, in real hearts, and in a real world that did everything it could to tear it apart. And if you think you already know how it ends, you are wrong. Because some love stories do not follow the rules. Some love stories break them, and the people inside them pay a price that most of us cannot even imagine. So before you judge, before you pick a side, read it all the way through. Because the truth, the real truth, is never as simple as it looks from the outside. It was the summer of 2016 in a small town on the coast of southern Turkey. The kind of town where everyone knew everyone. The kind of town where the baker knew your grandfather's name and the woman selling fish at the market remembered the day you were born. It was beautiful in its own quiet way. The sea stretched out like a blue blanket every morning, and the mountains behind the town stood tall and steady as if they were watching over the people below. Life moved slowly here. People woke up early. They drank tea. They talked about the weather and the price of tomatoes. They slept. And they repeated it all the next day. In this town lived a woman named Elif. She was 27 years old. She had dark brown hair that fell just below her shoulders, and her eyes were the color of honey when the sun hit them in a certain way. She was not the kind of woman who walked into a room and demanded attention. She was quiet. She was careful. She chose her words the way a jeweler chooses stones, slowly and with purpose. But there was something about her that made people look twice. Maybe it was the way she carried herself, straight-backed and calm, like a woman who had already survived something hard. Or maybe it was the sadness that lived behind her smile, a sadness she never talked about but everyone could feel. Elif worked at a small legal aid office near the center of town. She was not a lawyer. Not yet, but she was studying for her exams and helping where she could. She spent her days reading case files, answering phones and sitting with people who had nowhere else to go. Women who had been hurt by their husbands. Families who had lost their land. Young men accused of crimes they did not commit. The work was heavy, and the pay was almost nothing. But Elif did it because she believed in something. She believed that the law, the real law, was supposed to protect people. Not powerful people, not rich people, all people. She lived alone in a small apartment above a tailor's shop. 2 rooms, a narrow kitchen, and a balcony that looked out at the sea. Every night she would sit on that balcony with a glass of tea and a book in her lap and listen to the waves. It was the only time she felt truly at peace, because inside, underneath all the calm and the silence, Elif was fighting a war no one could see. Her family had arranged a marriage for her 2 years earlier. She had said no. She had said it clearly and without hesitation, and for that, they had cut her off. Her father refused to speak to her. Her mother cried every time they were in the same room. Her older brother Kadir had told her that she was a disgrace to the family name and that she was dead to him. All because she refused to marry a man she did not love. A man who was 20 years older than her. A man who had money, but no kindness. So Elif was alone. Not in the romantic, peaceful way that books describe. She was alone in the hard way. In the way that makes your chest feel empty at 2 a.m. when there is no one to call. She had a few friends, but even they kept their distance. In a town like this, standing too close to someone who had defied her family was like standing too close to a fire. You might get burned. Then, one morning in July, everything changed. A man walked into the legal aid office. He was tall, maybe 6 feet, with broad shoulders and skin that had been darkened by years in the sun. His hair was black and cut short, and he had a beard that looked like it had not been trimmed in weeks. His clothes were simple, a plain white shirt, dark trousers, and shoes that had walked too many miles. He stood just inside the door and looked around as if he were trying to decide whether to stay or run. There was something in his eyes that Elif recognized immediately. It was the look of a man who had been carrying something heavy for a very long time. His name was Daniel. He was 31 years old. He was not from Turkey. He was from a country in East Africa, a country that had been torn apart by war and corruption and the slow, crushing weight of poverty. He had left his homeland 3 years earlier, not because he wanted to, but because he had no choice. His family had been targeted by a local militia group. His father had been killed. His younger sister had disappeared. His mother had begged him to leave, to cross the sea, to find somewhere safe and start again. So he had. He had walked through deserts. He had crossed borders in the back of trucks. He had spent weeks on a boat so crowded that people stood pressed together like fish in a net, and he had washed up on the Turkish coast with nothing. No money, no papers, no name that anyone here could pronounce. For 3 years, Daniel had lived in the shadows. He worked in construction, lifting bricks and mixing cement under the hot sun for wages that barely kept him alive. He slept in a room he shared with 4 other men, all of them from different countries, all of them hiding from the same broken world. He did not complain. He did not ask for pity. He woke up, he worked, and he survived. But surviving is not the same as living, and Daniel knew the difference. He had come to the legal aid office because someone at the construction site had told him about it. They said there was a woman there who helped people like him. People without papers. People without a voice. He did not believe it at first. In his experience, no one helped people like him. Not for free. Not without wanting something in return. But he was running out of options. The police had started checking papers at the market, and 2 of his roommates had already been taken away. He did not know where they had been sent. He did not want to find out. Elif was at her desk when he walked in. She looked up from her papers and saw him standing in the doorway, and for a moment neither of them said anything. There was no lightning bolt, no dramatic music, no love at first sight. There was just a quiet understanding. 2 people standing on different sides of the same broken world, each carrying their own invisible weight. She stood and offered him a chair. He hesitated, then sat. She asked his name. He told her. She asked what he needed. He told her that too. His voice was low and steady, and he spoke Turkish with an accent that made every word sound like it had been carved from stone. He told her about his situation. No papers, no legal status, no way to work legally, no way to travel, no way to go back. She listened without interrupting. She took notes. She asked careful questions. And when he was finished, she looked at him and said something that he had not heard in 3 years. She said, "I will help you." He did not know what to say. In his world, those words meant nothing. People said them all the time and never followed through. But there was something in the way she said it, something in her eyes that told him she meant it. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, Daniel felt something shift inside his chest. It was small. It was fragile. But it was there. Hope. Over the next few weeks, Elif began working on Daniel's case. It was complicated. The laws around immigration and asylum in Turkey were tangled and confusing, and the system was designed more to keep people out than to let them in. She spent her evenings reading through legal codes and international treaties, looking for any opening, any small crack in the wall that she could push through. She called lawyers in the city. She contacted human rights organizations. She wrote letters and sent emails and filled out forms that seemed designed to break the spirit of anyone who touched them. Daniel came to the office twice a week. At first, their conversations were strictly professional. She asked about his background, his family, his journey. He answered in short, measured sentences. He did not give more than what was asked. He had learned a long time ago that sharing too much could be dangerous. But Elif was patient. She did not push. She did not pry. She simply sat with him and let the silence do its work. And slowly, over the course of those weeks, the silence began to change. It stopped being the silence of strangers and became the silence of 2 people who were beginning to trust each other. Daniel started staying a little longer after their meetings. He would ask about her work. She would ask about his day. He told her about the buildings he helped construct, about the way the sunset looked from the rooftop of an unfinished apartment block. She told him about the cases she was working on, about the old woman who came in every Tuesday convinced that her neighbor had stolen her cat. They laughed together. It was a small thing, but in both of their lives, laughter had become a rare and precious currency, and each time it happened, each time one of them said something that made the other smile, the wall between them got a little thinner. One evening in August, Elif was working late at the office. It was past 8, and the street outside was quiet. She heard a knock on the door and opened it to find Daniel standing there with a small plastic bag. Inside were 2 containers of food, rice and lentils and grilled chicken, the kind of food sold by the street vendors near the harbour. He said he had noticed that she often forgot to eat when she was working. She looked at him, and something in her chest moved in a way it had not moved in years. She invited him in. They sat across from each other at her desk and ate with plastic forks, and for the first time they talked about things that had nothing to do with legal cases or immigration papers. Daniel told her about his childhood, about the river behind his family's house where he used to swim with his sister. He told her about his mother's cooking, about the way she used to sing while she ground spices. His voice grew soft when he talked about these things, and Elif could see the boy he had been before the world had taken everything from him. She told him about her family, about the marriage she had refused, about her father's silence and her brother's anger. She told him about the loneliness of standing up for yourself in a place where standing up meant standing alone. She did not cry. She had stopped crying about these things a long time ago. But her voice trembled slightly, and Daniel noticed. He reached across the desk and placed his hand on hers, just for a moment, just long enough for her to feel the warmth of his skin. Then he pulled back and looked down at his food, and neither of them said anything about it. But they both knew something had changed. The weeks turned into months. Summer faded into autumn, and the air grew cooler and the days grew shorter. Daniel continued to come to the office, but now his visits were no longer just about paperwork. He came because he wanted to see her, and she stayed late because she wanted to see him. They did not name what was happening between them. They did not dare, because they both understood, even without saying it, that what they were feeling was dangerous. In this town, a Turkish woman and an African man together was not just unusual, it was unthinkable. It was the kind of thing that people talked about in low, angry voices behind closed doors. The kind of thing that turned friends into strangers and neighbors into enemies. Elif knew this. She had grown up in this world. She knew the weight of its expectations, the sharpness of its judgment. And Daniel knew it from a different angle. He knew what it meant to be the outsider, the one who did not belong, the one who was watched and whispered about wherever he went. But feelings do not follow rules. They do not check the law before they take root. And what was growing between Elif and Daniel was not something either of them had planned or chosen. It was simply there, as real and as stubborn as the tide. One evening in late October, they were walking along the harbor. The boats rocked gently in the water, and the moon hung low and full above the sea. They walked slowly, close but not touching, their footsteps falling in rhythm on the old stone path. Elif stopped and turned to face him. The moonlight caught her eyes, and for a moment, Daniel forgot how to breathe. She said, "I need to tell you something." He waited. She said, "I know what this is. I know what is happening between us. And I know what it would mean in this town, in this country, for someone like me to be with someone like you." He said nothing. He just watched her face. She took a deep breath and said, "I do not care." The words hung in the air between them like smoke. Daniel felt them settle into his bones. It wanted to tell her that she should care, that the world would make them pay for this, that he had nothing to offer her, no money, no status, no legal right to even be standing on this ground. He wanted to protect her from the storm he knew was coming, but instead he stepped forward, took her face gently in his hands and kissed her. And in that moment, on that old stone path by the harbor, with the sea whispering behind them and the moon watching from above, two people who had every reason in the world to be afraid chose not to be. They chose each other. And they knew, both of them, with absolute certainty, that nothing would ever be the same. What neither of them knew, what they could not have known, standing there in the silver light with their hearts beating fast and their hands shaking, was that the hardest part had not even begun, because the town had eyes, and the town had a memory, and the town did not forgive. And somewhere in the dark, someone was watching. The first few weeks after that night by the harbor were the closest thing to happiness that either Elif or Daniel had felt in years. They did not shout it from rooftops. They did not hold hands in the open streets or sit together at the cafes where the old men drank their morning tea. They were careful. They moved quietly. They met in the evenings at her apartment above the tailor's shop, where the curtains were thick and the world outside could not see them. They cooked together. They read together. They sat on the small balcony and watched the sea and talked in the low, easy voices of two people who had finally found someone who understood them. Daniel would bring groceries from the market, always going to the stalls farthest from the center of town where fewer people knew his face. Elif would prepare meals the way her mother had taught her, before the silence fell between them. Lentil soup, stuffed peppers, thin flatbread cooked on a hot pan. Daniel would watch her move around the kitchen, and sometimes he would shake his head and smile, and she would ask him what he was smiling about, and he would say, "Nothing. I just did not think I would ever have this." And she understood exactly what he meant. During the days, they kept their distance. Elif worked at the legal aid office and Daniel went to the construction sites. When he came by the office for appointments, they kept their voices professional and their eyes from lingering too long. It was an act, a performance, and they were both good at it, because both of them had spent years pretending to be something they were not. Elif had pretended to be the obedient daughter. Daniel had pretended to be invisible. They knew how to wear masks. But the difference now was that at the end of the day, when the masks came off, they had each other. But secrets in small towns are like water in cracked walls. They seep through slowly, silently, until one day the whole structure begins to shake. It started with small things. The woman who lived downstairs from Elif, the tailor's wife, began noticing the sound of 2 sets of footsteps on the stairs in the evenings. She noticed the faint smell of unfamiliar spices coming from under Elif's door. She noticed that the garbage Elif put out in the mornings sometimes contained 2 plates instead of 1. She said nothing at first. She simply watched. And she remembered. Then there was the boy at the market. He was 14, the son of one of the fishermen, and he had seen Daniel carrying a bag of tomatoes and onions up the hill toward Elif Street one evening. The boy did not think much of it at the time, but he mentioned it to his father, and his father mentioned it to another man, and that man mentioned it to his wife, and his wife mentioned it to the woman at the bakery, and by the time the story had travelled through the town's invisible network of whispers, it had grown from a simple observation into something much larger. People began to talk. At first, the talk was quiet. It was the kind of talk that happened over tea, in low voices, with raised eyebrows and shaking heads. "Did you hear about Elif, the one who refused to marry? They say she has a man visiting her at night. They say he is foreign. They say he is African." The words carried a weight that went beyond curiosity. In this town, a woman's reputation was like a glass window. One crack and the whole thing shattered. Elif did not notice at first. She was too wrapped up in the work, in the case, in the quiet joy of her evenings with Daniel. But Daniel noticed. He noticed the way people at the market looked at him differently, not with the usual indifference or the casual pity that he was used to. This was something sharper, something hostile. He noticed the construction foreman watching him more closely, asking questions about where he lived, who he spent time with. He noticed the conversations that stopped abruptly when he walked into a room. One afternoon in late November, Daniel came to the legal aid office with a bruise on his left arm. Elif saw it immediately. She reached for his sleeve, and he pulled back. "What happened?" she asked. "It is nothing," he said. "Daniel." He looked at her for a long moment, then sighed. He told her that 2 men had confronted him near the construction site that morning. He did not know their names, but he recognized their faces. They were local men, young with hard eyes and loud voices. They had blocked his path and told him that they knew what he was doing. They told him that a man like him had no business being near a woman like Elif. They used words that Daniel did not want to repeat, words about his skin, words about where he came from, words designed to make him feel like he was less than human. He had not fought back. He had stood still and let them say what they needed to say, and when they shoved him against the wall and walked away laughing, he had picked up his bag and gone to work, because that was what he did. That was what he had always done. He survived. He endured. He kept moving. But Elif was furious. Her hands trembled as she listened. Her jaw tightened. She wanted to go to the police. She wanted to file a report. She wanted to stand in the middle of the town square and scream at every single person who thought they had the right to decide who she could love. Daniel stopped her. He held her hands gently and looked into her eyes and said, "If you do that, it will get worse for both of us." She knew he was right. She hated that he was right. But she knew. So they continued as before, carefully, quietly, like 2 people walking across a frozen lake, knowing that the ice beneath them was growing thinner with every step. December came with cold winds and grey skies. The sea turned dark and rough, and the fishing boats stayed in the harbour. The town pulled inward, the way small towns do in winter, and the walls seemed to close in tighter. Elif continued working on Daniel's case. She had found a possible path to asylum through an international protection clause, but the paperwork required documentation that Daniel did not have. Birth certificates. identity papers, proof of persecution. All of it had been lost or destroyed during his journey. She was trying to find alternative ways to verify his identity, contacting embassies, reaching out to organizations that worked with refugees, sending letters to anyone who might be able to help. It was slow, frustrating work. The system was not designed to help people like Daniel. It was designed to process them, to sort them into categories, to stamp their files and move them along a conveyor belt that led, more often than not, to deportation. Elif pushed against the system every day, and every day the system pushed back. One evening, she came home to find a note taped to her door. It was written in Turkish, in large, messy letters. It said, "We know what you are doing. This is a warning." She stood in the hallway and stared at the note for a long time. Her hands were steady, but inside, something cold moved through her chest. She pulled the note from the door, folded it, and put it in her pocket. She did not tell Daniel about it that night. They ate dinner together and talked about other things. And when he left, she sat alone on the balcony and looked out at the dark sea and thought about what she was willing to lose. Because that was the question, was it not? What was she willing to lose? She had already lost her family. She had already lost her place in the world she grew up in. She had already lost the version of herself that did what she was told and kept her head down and smiled when she was supposed to smile. What was left? Her job, maybe. Her safety, certainly. Her life, possibly. And still, even as she turned these thoughts over in her mind like stones in her palm, she knew the answer. She was willing to lose all of it. Because what she had found with Daniel was the first real thing she had ever held. And she would not let go. The new year arrived without celebration. January was bitter and wet, and the town felt emptier than usual. Many of the seasonal workers had left. The tourists were long gone. Only the permanent residents remained. And among them, the whispers had grown into something louder. Elif's name was spoken openly now, at the tea houses, at the mosque, at the school gates where mothers gathered to pick up their children. The story had taken on a life of its own. She was living with a foreign man, an illegal immigrant, a man with no papers and no name. She was bringing shame to the town. She was breaking the law. The last part was not entirely wrong. Housing an undocumented person was technically a violation of Turkish immigration law. It could result in fines or worse, criminal charges. Elif knew this. She had studied the statutes. She knew exactly which laws she was bending and which ones she was breaking. But she also knew that the law, the version of the law that she believed in, was supposed to serve justice. And there was no justice in punishing a woman for loving a man whose only crime was being born in the wrong place. Her boss at the legal aid office, an older man named Hassan, called her into his office one afternoon. He was a kind man with tired eyes and a voice like gravel. He had been running the office for 20 years and he had seen more suffering pass through his doors than most people see in a lifetime. He cared about Elif. He respected her work, and he was worried. He closed the door and sat down heavily in his chair. "Elif," he said, "I need to talk to you about something, and I need you to listen without interrupting." She sat across from him and waited. He told her that he had received calls from the local council, from the police chief, from people in the community who had connections and influence. They were asking questions about the office, about its funding, about its activities, about the kind of people it was helping, and specifically about Elif and her relationship with a man named Daniel, an undocumented African migrant. Hassan leaned forward and looked at her with eyes full of worry and something else that might have been admiration. "I am not going to tell you what to do with your personal life," he said. "That is not my business, but I need you to understand what is happening. These people are not asking questions because they are curious. They are looking for a reason to shut this office down. And if they find one, it will not just be you who suffers. It will be every person who walks through that door looking for help." Elif felt the weight of his words settle on her shoulders like wet cloth. She understood what he was saying. Her choices were not just about her anymore. They affected other people with real problems who had nowhere else to go. She went home that night and found Daniel waiting for her on the balcony. He had made tea. She took the cup from his hands and stood next to him, looking out at the water, and she told him everything. The note on the door, the calls to her office, the pressure from the council and the police. She did not soften it or hide it. She gave it to him straight, because that was how they had always been with each other. Daniel listened. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. The wind pulled at his shirt and the sound of the waves filled the silence between them. Then he spoke. "I should leave," he said. The words hit her like a physical blow. She turned to face him. "What?" "I should leave this town. I should go somewhere else. Maybe to the city. I can find work there. I can disappear. And you can have your life back." She stared at him. "You think that is what I want? My life back? Which life? The one where I was alone? The one where I spent every night on this balcony talking to the sea because there was no one else who would listen? Elif? No." Her voice was firm. Not angry, firm. "I did not choose this because it was easy. I chose it because it was true. And I am not going to let a group of small-minded people take it away from me." Daniel looked at her, and in the dim light from the kitchen behind them, she could see that his eyes were wet. He blinked and turned away, but she had already seen it. She reached for his hand and held it, and they stood like that for a long time, two people holding on to each other while the wind tried to push them apart. The next morning, Elif made a decision. She was not going to hide anymore. She was not going to creep around in the dark like she was doing something wrong. She called a lawyer in Ankara, a woman named Zeynep who specialized in human rights cases. She explained the situation. Everything. Daniel's background, his asylum claim, their relationship, the threats from the community. Zeynep listened carefully, asked precise questions, and then said something that gave Elif a thin thread of hope. "There is a legal pathway," Zeynep said. "It is narrow and it is difficult, but it exists. If Daniel can be granted international protection status, his legal situation changes completely. He would have the right to live and work in Turkey legally, and a relationship between a Turkish citizen and a person with legal protection status, while still controversial in some circles, is not a crime." "How long would it take?" Elif asked. "Months. Maybe a year, and there is no guarantee. The rejection rate is high and the process is full of bureaucratic obstacles. But if we build a strong case, if we can document his persecution, verify his identity through alternative means, and present a compelling argument for protection, there is a chance." It was not much, but it was more than they had before. Elif threw herself into the work. She spent every free moment preparing the case. She contacted international organizations that tracked human rights abuses in Daniel's home country. She gathered news reports, witness statements, and expert opinions. She compiled a file that grew thicker by the week, each page a small brick in the wall they were building between Daniel and the forces that wanted to send him back to a place where he would almost certainly be killed. Daniel helped where he could. He wrote down everything he remembered about the militia group that had targeted his family. Names, dates, locations, the sound of gunfire at night, the smell of smoke from burning houses, the face of the man who had pointed a gun at his father's head. Writing these things down was like reopening old wounds. And there were nights when he would sit at the kitchen table with a pen in his hand and tears running silently down his face. Elif would sit beside him, not speaking, just present, her hand on his back, her warmth a reminder that he was no longer alone in the dark. February brought rain. It fell for days without stopping, turning the streets into rivers and the sea into a churning grey mass. The town felt smaller than ever, and the tension in the air was thick enough to touch. Elif noticed that people she had known for years were crossing the street to avoid her. The woman at the bakery who had always saved her a loaf of bread now looked through her as if she were made of glass. The old man who ran the newspaper stand, who used to tell her stories about the town's history, now turned his back when she passed. It hurt. She would not pretend it did not. These were the people she had grown up around. These were the faces of her childhood. And now they looked at her like she was a stranger, or worse, like she was a traitor. But she kept going. She filed the asylum application through the Regional Migration Authority. She submitted the supporting documents. She made follow-up calls that went to voicemail. She wrote follow-up letters that received no response. The system moved at its own pace, indifferent to the urgency of the lives caught inside it. Then, in the middle of February, something happened that changed everything. Elif was walking home from the office one evening when she saw a crowd gathered outside the tailor's shop beneath her apartment. She quickened her pace. As she got closer, she saw two police cars parked at the curb. Their lights were flashing, painting the walls of the buildings in strokes of blue and red. Her heart began to pound. She pushed through the crowd and found two officers standing at the bottom of the stairs that led to her apartment. "Elif Kara?" one of them said. "Yes. We need you to come with us." "Why? What happened?" The officer did not answer her question. He simply repeated the request, more firmly this time. Elif looked up at her apartment. The door was open. She could hear sounds from inside, the opening and closing of drawers, the shuffle of footsteps. They were searching her home. She was taken to the police station and put in a room with a table and two chairs. The room smelled like cigarettes and cleaning fluid. She sat there for an hour before anyone came in. When the door finally opened, it was not a regular officer. It was a man in a dark suit with a folder in his hand. He introduced himself as an investigator from the Migration Authority. He sat down across from her and opened the folder. Inside were photographs. Photographs of her and Daniel, walking by the harbor, standing on her balcony, entering her building together. Someone had been following them. Someone had been documenting everything. The investigator looked at her with cold, professional eyes. "Elif Kara," he said. "You are being investigated for harboring an undocumented foreign national and for aiding and abetting illegal residents. These are serious charges. Do you understand?" She looked at the photographs spread out on the table in front of her. She looked at the faces captured in those images. Her face and Daniel's, frozen in moments of ordinary life that had been turned into evidence of a crime. And she felt something harden inside her. Not fear, not sadness, something else. Something sharper. She looked up at the investigator and said, "I understand. Do you have anything to say?" She thought about all the things she could say. She thought about the law, about the right to international protection, about the asylum application that was sitting in some bureaucrat's inbox waiting to be processed. She thought about Daniel, about where he was right now, about whether they had already found him. She thought about the town, about the whispers and the stares and the note on her door. She thought about all of it. And then she leaned forward, looked the investigator directly in the eyes and said, "I want a lawyer. You will have one." He said, "But this is not going away, Miss Kara. You should prepare yourself." He left the room and the door closed behind him with a sound like a sentence being handed down. Elif sat alone in the silence and thought about Daniel. She wondered if he was safe. She wondered if he was afraid. And she made herself a promise sitting there in that cold, ugly room with the fluorescent light buzzing overhead and the faint smell of cigarettes in her lungs. She promised that she would not break. No matter what they did, no matter what they said, no matter how hard the world pressed down on her, she would not break. Because some things were worth fighting for. And some people were worth everything. Elif spent the night at the police station. They did not put her in a cell, but they did not let her leave either. She sat in a waiting area on a plastic chair, under a light that never turned off. The walls were painted a dull green, and the floor was cold beneath her feet. Officers walked past her without looking at her. Phones rang. Doors opened and closed. The night passed in a blur of noise and silence that blended together until she could not tell the difference. She did not sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Daniel's face. She wondered where he was. She wondered if he had been at the apartment when the police arrived. She wondered if he was hiding somewhere in the dark, cold and alone and thinking the same thoughts she was thinking. She held on to the memory of his voice, the low, steady sound of it, like an anchor in the storm. In the morning, they released her. They told her she was free to go, but that the investigation was ongoing and she was not to leave the town. She walked out of the station into a cold, grey morning. The air tasted like salt and rain. Her body ached from sitting in that chair all night, and her mind was sharp with the kind of clarity that only comes after fear. She went straight to her apartment. The door was still unlocked. Inside, the rooms had been turned upside down, drawers pulled open, papers scattered across the floor, books pulled from shelves. Her laptop was gone. So was the folder with Daniel's case documents. The months of careful research and correspondence that she had built page by page. She stood in the middle of the mess and felt the anger rise inside her like heat from a fire. But she did not break. She had made a promise, and she intended to keep it. She picked up her phone and called Zeynep, the human rights lawyer in Ankara. Zeynep answered on the second ring. Elif told her what had happened, her voice calm and controlled, each word placed carefully like a foot on a narrow bridge. Zainab listened and then said, "I will be there by tomorrow. Do not speak to anyone. Do not sign anything. Do not answer any questions without me present. Do you understand?" "I understand." "And Elif, dialectia. We are going to fight this." Elif hung up the phone and sat down on her bed. The sheets were pulled back, and the mattress was half off the frame where the police had searched beneath it. She straightened the bed. She picked up the papers from the floor. She closed the drawers. She put the books back on the shelves. She cleaned her home the way a soldier repairs a camp after an attack, methodically and without emotion, because if she let the emotion in, she would drown in it. Then she went looking for Daniel. She checked the construction site first. The foreman told her that Daniel had not come to work that day. She checked the room he shared with the other workers. The door was open, and the room was empty. The beds were stripped. The belongings that had been scattered around, a few shirts, a pair of shoes, a radio with a cracked speaker, were gone. Someone had cleaned the place out, or someone had been taken. Ella felt her heart begin to race. She walked through the streets, checking every place she could think of. The small park by the mosque where Daniel sometimes sat in the shade, the bench near the harbour where they had watched the boats, the alley behind the bakery where a kind old woman sometimes gave leftover bread to the workers. He was nowhere. She was about to give up when her phone rang. She did not recognize the number. She answered it, and the voice on the other end was one she knew instantly. "Elif, it is me." The relief that flooded through her body was so powerful that her knees almost buckled. "Daniel, where are you? Are you safe?" "I am safe. I am with a friend, a man from the construction site. He has a house in the village outside town. I came here when I saw the police cars. They searched the apartment. They took everything. My laptop, your case file." Then Daniel said, "I am sorry. This is my fault. Do not say that. This is not your fault. None of this is your fault. Elif, listen to me. Maybe it is time for me to go. I can go east. I can find a way to cross into another country. I can." "No." Her voice was sharp enough to cut glass. "You are not running. Not now. Not when we are this close. Zainab is coming. She is a real lawyer, a good one, and she knows what she is doing. The asylum application is already in the system. If you disappear now, it all falls apart."
It was quiet for a long time. She could hear him breathing.
She could hear the wind on his end of the line, and she imagined him standing in a doorway somewhere, looking out at a sky he did not belong to. "I am afraid," he said softly. "Not for me. For you." "I know," she said. "I am afraid too. But we are not doing this alone. Not anymore." Zainab arrived the next day on a bus from Ankara. She was a woman in her 50s with short grey hair, sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, and a manner that suggested she had spent decades arguing with people who did not want to listen, and winning. She carried a leather briefcase and a determination that was almost visible, like a force field around her body. She met Elif at a small cafe near the bus station. They sat in the corner, away from the windows, and Elif laid out everything. The investigation, the charges, the confiscated documents, the threats from the community, the photographs that someone had taken of her and Daniel. Zainab took notes in a small black notebook, her handwriting tight and precise. When Elif finished, Zainab looked up from her notes and said, "Here is what we are dealing with. The charges against you are real but thin. Harboring an undocumented person is a legal offense, but the penalties are typically administrative, fines, not criminal prosecution, especially for a first offense. The fact that you are a legal aid worker who is actively assisting with an asylum application complicates their case. You were not hiding him. You were helping him navigate a legal process. That distinction matters." "And Daniel? His situation is more precarious. If they find him before the asylum application is processed, he could be detained and eventually deported." "Our priority is to accelerate the application. I have contacts at the Migration Authority in Ankara. I will make calls. I will push." "Can we win?" Elif asked. Zainab looked at her for a long moment. "I have spent 30 years doing this work," she said. "I have seen cases that looked hopeless turn around in a day, and I have seen cases that looked certain fall apart overnight. The law is not a machine. It is a living thing shaped by the people who interpret it. So can we win? I do not know. But I can tell you this, we will not lose because we did not try. Over the next several weeks, Zeynep worked with a ferocity that Aleph had never seen in another human being. She filed motions. She called judges. She contacted the National Ombudsman's office. She reached out to international human rights organizations and foreign embassies. She wrote letters that were part legal argument and part moral sermon, each one a carefully crafted weapon aimed at the soft spots in the bureaucratic armor. Meanwhile, the pressure on Elif intensified. The investigation continued. She was called in for questioning twice more, and each time Zeynep sat beside her and answered questions with the precision of a surgeon. The local council sent a formal complaint to the legal aid office, accusing it of using public funds to support illegal activity. Hassan, her boss, held firm. He refused to fire her. He refused to close the office. But the strain was visible on his face, in the new lines around his eyes and the way his hands shook slightly when he held his tea. The town grew colder, not just in temperature but in spirit. Elif received more notes, slipped under her door, left on her car windshield, tucked into the handle of the office door. Some were angry. Some were threatening. One contained a single word that she would not repeat but that burned itself into her memory like a brand. She kept every one of them. She filed them as evidence. She turned each act of hatred into a brick in the wall of their legal defense. Daniel stayed in the village outside town. Elif visited him when she could, driving the narrow road through the hills in the dark, her headlights cutting through the rain. The man who was sheltering him was a Syrian refugee named Ahmad, a quiet man with kind eyes who had been living in the village for 2 years. Ahmad asked no questions. He gave Daniel a room, shared his food, and treated him with the simple dignity of one displaced person to another. When Elif thanked him, Ahmad shrugged and said, "We have all been in the dark. The least we can do is hold the door open for each other." March arrived and brought with it a small piece of news that felt enormous. Zeynep called Elif one morning and said, "The Migration Authority has acknowledged the asylum application. It has been assigned a case number and a hearing date." Elif sat down on her bed and pressed the phone against her ear. When? 6 weeks. It felt like both a lifetime and a heartbeat. They had a date. They had a chance. And for the first time in months, Elif allowed herself to feel something that she had been holding at arm's length. She allowed herself to hope. But the town was not finished. 3 days before the hearing, Elif came home from work to find her brother Kadir waiting for her outside her apartment. She had not seen him in over a year. He was leaner than she remembered, and his face had the hardened look of a man who had been carrying anger like a stone in his pocket for too long. He stood with his arms crossed and his jaw set, and when she saw him, her stomach dropped. "Kadir," she said, "we need to talk." She did not invite him inside. They stood in the hallway, the narrow space between them filled with years of unspoken words and broken trust. He told her that their father was sick. The old man's heart was failing. The doctors said it could be weeks or months, but the end was coming. Their mother was struggling. The family was falling apart. And it was her fault. All of it. Her refusal to marry. Her rebellion. Her shameful relationship with a foreign man. She had brought disgrace on the family, and now their father was dying of a broken heart. She did not interrupt. She let him say everything he needed to say. Every accusation. Every guilt-laden word. Every poisoned arrow aimed at her conscience. And when he was finished, when the silence settled between them like dust after an explosion, she spoke. "I am sorry that father is sick," she said. "I love him. I have always loved him. And I am sorry that my choices have caused pain. But I am not sorry for making them. I am not sorry for refusing to marry a man I did not love. I am not sorry for helping someone who needed help. And I am not sorry for falling in love with a good man, a kind man, a man who has suffered more than you or I can imagine, and who deserves to be treated like a human being." Kadir stared at her. His mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. She could see the conflict in his eyes, the war between the anger he had been carrying and something else, something softer, something that remembered the sister he used to know, the girl who used to make him laugh, the girl who used to chase him through the garden with a stick pretending it was a sword. He turned and walked away without saying another word. She watched him go, his figure growing smaller as he descended the stairs and disappeared into the street. She stood there for a long time, her hand on the wall, her heart beating in her throat. Then she went inside, closed the door and allowed herself 5 minutes of tears before she wiped her face and went back to work. The hearing was held in a government building in the regional capital, a 2-hour drive from the town. It was a plain square building with fluorescent lights and linoleum floors and the stale recycled air that all government buildings seem to share. Elif, Daniel and Zeynep arrived early. Daniel wore the one good shirt he owned, a blue button-down that Ahmad's wife had ironed for him. His hands were steady, but Elif could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw tightened when he looked at the building's entrance. They sat in a waiting room with plastic chairs and a television playing the news on mute. Other people waited alongside them, families with young children, single men with haunted eyes, women clutching folders of documents to their chests. The room smelled like anxiety and floor cleaner. Each person here carried a story. Each person was waiting for someone behind a desk to decide whether their story was worth believing. Daniel's name was called just after noon. They entered a small hearing room where a panel of 3 officials sat behind a long table, 2 men and 1 woman. They wore serious expressions and had stacks of paper in front of them. Zeynep had prepared Daniel thoroughly. She had coached him on what to say and, more importantly, what not to say. She had told him to be honest, to be specific, and to be himself. The hearing lasted 2 hours. Daniel told his story. He told it from the beginning, from the night the militia came, from the sound of his father's last breath, from the emptiness of the house after his sister vanished, from his mother's hands pushing him out the door and her voice saying, "Go, go, go." He told them about the journey, the desert, the trucks, the boat, the water. He told them about 3 years of invisibility, of working in the shadows, of sleeping in rooms that smelled like sweat and concrete, of never feeling safe. He did not cry. His voice did not waver. He spoke the way he always spoke, with a low, steady calm that made every word sound like a fact rather than a plea. And when he was finished, the room was silent. Zeynep presented the supporting documents, the news reports confirming the militia's activity in Daniel's region, the statements from human rights organizations documenting the patterns of violence, the expert testimony on conditions in his home country, the alternative identity verification documents she had obtained through an international network of legal advocates. She laid it all out with the precision and confidence of a woman who had built her entire life around the belief that the law could be a tool for justice if you wielded it correctly. The panel asked questions. They asked about inconsistencies in dates. They asked about missing documents. They asked why Daniel had not applied for asylum sooner. Zeynep answered each question with facts and legal precedents, her voice never rising above a conversational tone but carrying the weight of absolute certainty. When the hearing ended, the panel said they would issue their decision within 30 days. 30 days. Another wait. Another stretch of uncertainty. Daniel, Elif, and Zeynep walked out of the building into the afternoon sunlight, and for a moment, none of them spoke. They just stood there, blinking in the brightness, feeling the weight of what they had just done. Zeynep was the first to speak. "You did well," she said to Daniel. "Both of you." Elif reached for his hand, and this time, standing in front of the government building in broad daylight, she did not let go. The 30 days felt like a year. Elif went back to work. Daniel stayed in the village. They talked every night on the phone, their voices low and tired but always warm. They talked about ordinary things, what they had eaten for dinner, a funny thing that Ahmad's cat had done, a book that Elif was reading. They built their future in these small, quiet moments, brick by brick, word by word, one night at a time. On the 27th day, Zeynep called. "The decision is in," she said. They granted it. Daniel has been given international protection status. Elif did not speak. She could not. The words hit her like a wave, and for several seconds she simply stood in the middle of her kitchen with the phone pressed to her ear and her hand over her mouth, unable to move, unable to breathe, unable to do anything except feel the enormous, crushing, overwhelming relief of a weight being lifted from her shoulders. "Elif," Zeynep said, "are you there?" "I am here," she whispered. "Thank you. Thank you." She drove too fast on the narrow road, and the headlights bounced off the trees, and her hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that her knuckles turned white. When she pulled up to Ahmad's house, Daniel was standing in the doorway. He had already heard. Ahmad's wife had come running from the neighbor's house with the news, and Daniel had stood there in the doorway ever since, waiting for her. She got out of the car and walked toward him, and he walked toward her, and they met in the middle of the dirt road in front of the house. She looked up at him. He looked down at her. The night was clear and cold, and the stars above them were so bright they looked like someone had scattered diamonds across black velvet. "We did it," she said. He shook his head slowly. "You did it. We did it," she repeated. And then she was in his arms, and his face was in her hair, and they held each other with the desperate, grateful grip of two people who had been clinging to the edge of a cliff and had finally been pulled to safety. The days that followed were a blur of paperwork and procedure, but this time the paperwork was different. This time it carried a future inside it. Daniel was issued a temporary protection identification card. He was given the legal right to live and work in Turkey. He could walk the streets without fear. He could work without hiding. He could exist. The investigation against Elif was quietly dropped. The charges were thin to begin with, and with Daniel's legal status resolved, the local authorities had no appetite for a prolonged fight against a human rights lawyer with international connections. The whispers in the town continued for a while, as whispers always do, but they grew softer over time, the way a storm fades once it has spent its energy. One afternoon in May, as the town began to warm again and the sea turned from grey to blue, Elif walked into the legal aid office and found a letter on her desk. It was from her mother. It was short, just a few lines written in her mother's careful, shaking handwriting. It said, "I do not understand your choices. I may never understand them. But you are my daughter, and I love you, and the door is open if you want to come home." Elif held the letter in her hands and read it 3 times. Then she folded it carefully and placed it in the drawer of her desk, next to the threatening notes she had collected over the months. She kept them all together, the hatred and the love, side by side, because that was the truth of her story. It contained both. It always had. Daniel found work at a small furniture workshop in the town. The owner was a quiet man who cared more about the quality of a person's hands than the color of their skin. Daniel was good with wood. He had learned it from his father, years ago, in another life. He made tables and chairs and shelves, and each piece he crafted carried in it a silent conversation with the father he had lost, the home he had left behind, and the new life he was building from scratch. He moved into Elif's apartment. They did not make an announcement. They did not ask for permission. They simply began living their life together, openly and without apology, the way they had always wanted to. The tailor's wife downstairs still looked at them with suspicion, but she said nothing. The fishermen at the harbour still whispered when they passed, but the whispers had lost their sharpness. The world had not changed overnight. Prejudice had not evaporated, but a crack had appeared in the wall, and through it, light was coming in. One evening in June, Elif and Daniel sat on the balcony and watched the sun go down over the sea. The sky was painted in shades of orange and purple and gold, and the water reflected the colours back like a mirror. The air smelled like salt and jasmine, and somewhere down the street, a radio was playing a song that neither of them recognized, but both of them liked. Daniel reached into his pocket and pulled out a small wooden box. He had made it himself, carved from a piece of olive wood, polished until it glowed. He placed it in Elif's hands. She opened it and found inside a simple ring, not gold, not silver, but carved from the same olive wood, smooth and warm to the touch. "I cannot give you diamonds," he said. "I cannot give you a big house or a fancy car or any of the things that people say you are supposed to have, but I can give you this, a promise, that wherever we go, whatever happens, I will be beside you. The way you were beside me when the whole world told you to walk away." Elif looked at the ring. She looked at him. And for the first time in as long as she could remember, she did not have to choose between what was expected and what was real. She did not have to weigh her heart against the judgment of others. She simply slipped the ring onto her finger and smiled. "It fits," she said. He smiled back. "I know." They sat together on that balcony as the last of the light drained from the sky and the stars began to appear, one by one, like old friends arriving at a gathering. The sea whispered below them. The town went about its evening. And two people who had come from different ends of the earth, who had been broken by different storms, who had found each other in the most unlikely of places, sat side by side and breathed in the night air and said nothing at all. Because sometimes, after everything has been said and done, after the battles have been fought and the laws have been bent and the world has done its worst, sometimes silence is the most beautiful sound there is. And sometimes, just sometimes, love wins. Not because it is easy, not because it is allowed, but because the people inside it refuse to let it die. This is their story. It is not finished. Stories like this never are. They keep going, day after day, quiet and stubborn and real. And if you ever find yourself in a small town on the coast of southern Turkey, and you happen to walk by a little apartment above a tailor's shop, and you hear laughter coming from the balcony, and you look up and see two people sitting together in the fading light, know this: they earned that laughter, every single note of it. And the world, for all its cruelty and all its rules, could not take it away from them. Not then, not now, not ever.